Hey folks, George here. Today I want to talk about the Japanese comic book, What is Obscenity? The story of a good-for-nothing artist and her pussy. This is created by a Japanese feminist artist, Rokudenashiko. This is obviously going to be a very controversial work. Right there in the title, she uses what some of us would call vulgar language. However, the main part of the title is What is Obscenity? That reminds us that this text is about censorship. And how does censorship work? And how does censorship work for a female feminist artist in Japan in the 21st century? As always, I'll talk about the story elements, characters, setting, plot, and theme. I'll also talk about connections that we can make, including the formal structure of the work, the history of the work and the history around the work, as well as intertextual connections and my own personal connections with this text. Well, let's start by just explaining the plot, how the story develops, because I always think that that's the easiest way to go. First, we begin with the artist, Rokudenashiko, and she creates manko art. What is manko art? Manko being a Japanese euphemism for pussy, right? And that is the pussy of the title. So throughout this video, I'll use the word manko as a translation for vagina, pussy, or however you take it, yes? She creates this manko art and she gives various examples, including phone covers, things like that. However, she takes this manko art to the next level and designs a full-size kayak modeled on her vagina. She distributes the digital data, the 3D digital data of this art to her followers, to her fans. And as a result of that, she is arrested for violating Article 175 of the Japanese Code. This all happens in 2014, yes? The story then goes on to share her struggles in prison and how she's freed. Part 2 of the text explains her history as a comics artist and as a feminist artist in general. And then Part 3 wraps up by asking the question, what is manko? And explaining what manko is. However, this text does, because this text was published in 2014, does not explain what ultimately concludes in 2020, 6 years later.
6 years later, in 2020, the Supreme Court of Japan rejected her appeal, and thus her guilty verdict stood for distributing an obscenity.
Let's give a little bit of an introduction here before I start. I am saying, and I'm going to use the word manko in this text, the Japanese word. Why? Because this word pussy, that is in the title, the English title of this text, is rather controversial. I'll talk about how controversial at the end of this discussion. It's so controversial that it did affect me personally, right? So I will try to use the word manko throughout this text. I've already said what that means and how we might translate that. But throughout the text, she explains that in Japan, Rokudenashiko, the artist herself, cannot use this word manko, right? She asks, wait, it's just a part of my body. What's wrong with saying this part of my body? It's no different from my hands or my feet, right? In court, she uses the word, and the judge says, wait a second, don't use this language, right? So throughout, she's challenging the mores of Japanese society such that naming and expressing and saying the name of her body is censored through and through her experience as a female in Japan. Yes, and that is where we're going to wrestle with so many complicated issues throughout this text. So let's talk a little bit about this history of censorship in Japan. One thing that's going to be interesting here is a discussion of history is going to be intertwined with a discussion of intertextual connections. That is, I'm going to talk about so many different texts, the history of so many different texts, and censorship of these texts. So, let's get started. let's start by discussing some history, especially the history of censorship, especially the history of censoring females in Japan. Let's go all the way back to the beginning of Japanese literature, the Kojiki. In the Kojiki, we see the god Izanagi tell his wife, Izanami, it is not proper that a woman should speak first. So there, right from the very beginnings, we see in Japanese literature this censoring of women's expression. Later, in the tale of Genji, during the Heian era, we see that the author, Murasaki, actually has to defend the actual art that she's making as a fiction writer in Heian, Japan, as a female fiction writer in Japan. There's a passage that reads, "Women seem to have been born to be cheerfully deceived. They know perfectly well that in all these old stories there is scarcely a shred of truth, and yet they are captured and made sport of by the whole range of trivialities." In that little passage, we see that a male character is telling the female characters, you women are concerned with trivialities and fictions, lies. Why are you so drawn to such terrible words, terrible works? Murasaki defends herself as a writer of fiction, as a female writer of fiction, and she has to say, even in the writ which the Buddha drew from his noble heart are parables. Parables being fiction. So we see from the very earliest elements of Japanese literature this attempt to censor women's expression, right? And the expression of sexuality in some sort or another. We have the famous ukiyo-e illustration by Hokusai, The Dream of a Fisherman's Wife, where the octopus is having some sort of fornication with a woman. We also see Chikamatsu's love suicide bunraku plays from the Edo era as well. Why do I bring those up? Because even in the Edo era, there are censorship laws enacted by the shogunate, right? There are so many censorship laws, such that those ukiyo-e illustrations were outlawed, such that the Chikamatsu love suicide plays were censored and outlawed. So there is a history. Now, the question is, were those laws enforced during the Edo era? Well, that's a complicated question, right? The point being that there was a move to censor sexually explicit works in the pre-modern era. So let's bring this up to the modern era then, yes? In a previous video, I discuss Kishida Toshiko and her seminal essay or speech entitled Daughters in Boxes. What happened to Kishida Toshiko in the early Meiji era? She was arrested for saying such things, such as we should educate women. Women should be free. Women are endowed with liberty. She was jailed for these things. Of course, that was in 1883. Later, in 1957, the famous Lady Chatterley's lover case is enacted, where it was declared that obscenity is that which wantonly stimulates or arouses sexual desire or offends the normal sense of sexual modesty of ordinary persons and is contrary to proper ideas of sexual morality. The courts must protect society from moral corruption. Again, there is just more and more examples of censorship, especially even in modern Japan. Another famous case is the In the Realm of the Senses case, right? I made a previous video of this movie, In the Realm of the Senses, by Oshima. What's interesting about this case, however, is this case isn't trying to censor the movie, because after all, Oshima was smart and did all kinds of wiggling around to make it so that this film couldn't be censored. But first of all, he sent the footage, although he filmed it in Japan, sent the footage to France and the film was developed in France, right? However, a book about the movie was subject to censorship in 1980, right? And Oshima is very adamant here, right? And I've said else in that video, right? The moment that it gets involved in porn, politics has already been defeated, Oshima says, famously. What is that saying there? The sexual expression is political expression. Pornography, Oshima is suggesting, is political expression. I've talked about that in other ways when I discuss moral philosophy and the moral entailments of pornography and hate speech in similar ways. Another famous case in modern Japanese history is in 2002, the Honey Room case. Honey Room was an explicit comic. The first time a comic had been put on trial for obscenity in Japan. Here's the funny thing. Many people might say, many people in my position who teach this kind of stuff, say things like, oh, in Japan, comics are for adults. Adults read comics. People across the generations read comics in Japan. Yet, the famous decision in this 2002 case expressed the idea of the courts that comics really are for kids, even in Japan, and that justifies censoring comics, sexually explicit comics, because it might poison the minds of kids, right? The prosecutor argued that these kinds of comics will inevitably lead children to sex crimes. And of course, this recalls famous sensationalist murder cases, the otaku murderer, Miyazaki Tsutomu, of the 1980s, right? Another stress that's imposed upon Japan regarding censorship of comics is by UNICEF, the UN organization, the United Nations organization, where UNICEF criticizes Japanese laws because they allow the distribution of child pornography. Child pornography, in this case, being comics, right? That is an interesting philosophical question, an interesting moral question. Are comics, illustrations, the same thing as child pornography? Well, certain people certainly try to make that argument. The conclusion of the Honey Room case was that the comic was found guilty to be obscene. Why? Because it was so realistic. Realistic, whatever that means when we're talking about comics, right? Here's a couple of more interesting modern, very contemporary historical instances of the censorship specifically of women in Japan. The Tokyo Olympics, which happened in were scheduled to happen in 2020, but this little thing called COVID happened, and they ended up happening in 2021. One of the leaders of the Tokyo Olympic Committee, Mori Yoshido, was famous for saying, "Women talk too much in meetings." That seems to be trying to silence women. Another famous incident is from 2014, when Ayaka Shiomura experienced heckling at the Tokyo municipal government, right? She's up there, a politician speaking, and other politicians are yelling at her, saying things like, "You're the one who should hurry up and get married. Can't you even bear a child?" Again, this putting down of women's expression. So there is a complicated and rich history of censoring women in Japan, not just in pre-modern times, not just in ancient times, but also in the modern era as well, right? So let's talk about some of the laws that are in play. Well, the Meiji Code stipulates in Article 175, this is from 1907, it was revised in 2011, but that distributing obscene documents is prohibited. However, there is a bit of conflict here, isn't there? Because in the 1947 Constitution, Article 13 suggests There should be a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Sounds familiar, right? To the extent that they do not interfere with public welfare. That seems to be a nice way to wiggle out of the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the pursuit of freedom of expression. Article 14 of the 1947 Constitution says that all are equal based on sex, and other things as well. And Article 21, of course, says there shall be freedom of speech, that no censorship shall be maintained. But let's go back to Article 13 again, right? To the extent that they do not interfere with public welfare. Again, that's a nice wiggly space for a lot of censorship to happen. If you could show that some expression interferes with public welfare, well then, there you go. There you go. And there is the past stipulation that distributing obscene materials is prohibited, such that it must, I guess, assume, if I put 2 and 2 together, obscene materials somehow interfere with the public welfare. So with that in mind, we could get a better sense of the history in which Rokudenashiko, this feminist artist, is working and trying to be an artist saying something interesting about women's experience in Japan. Who are the characters of this comic? The obvious first answer is Rokudenashiko herself, the artist. What does Rokudenashiko mean? Rokudenashiko is a pseudonym for somebody who was born with the name Igarashi Megumi. So why does she use the name Rokudenashiko? A pseudonym. It means good for nothing girl. She's good for nothing. And even the notion that she's a so-called artist, the so-called artist in the title, was imposed upon her by the media, the mainstream media. In addition to the character Rokudenashiko herself, the artist herself, she also relays some elements of the stories, the lives of her advocates, those lawyers and public speakers who are fighting for her rights. Yes, she talks about people who are really fighting for her, unbeknownst to her almost, at certain points. Who else does she talk about? She talks about the prosecutors, and she does talk about many characters in the legal system, right? She says the cops and the prosecutors are so stupid. They don't even know what they're prosecuting her for. After all, she is prosecuted for the distribution of digital materials. And many of the cops and prosecutors don't even know how these digital materials work. They don't know how crowdfunding works, because that is the mechanism by which she communicates with many of her fans and supporters through crowdfunding. Yet prosecutors, cops, don't even know this. So she herself calls the cops and prosecutors stupid. Let's talk about the themes now. The dominant theme of this work is censorship. What is censorship? Well, I'm going to steal an idea from Kirsten Cather as a working definition, that censorship is a criminal judicial proceeding in a modern liberal democratic society. How does that work? Well, it's criminal in that cops and prosecutors, the government, is silencing certain expression. How is it silencing it? By calling it criminal. What do you do with criminals? You put them in jail. You exile them from society, or in lesser instances, impose very serious fines upon them, right? And how do you do this? By, again, recalling that old Meiji Code, that obscene documents shall not be distributed. If you call something obscene, you've criminalized that expression. Why was this so obscene? What is it that is so obscene? Rokudenashiko is brilliant in giving us so many illustrations, not just illustrations though, but also photographs in this work of the works that were censored, right? Well, she shows exactly how it comes to be that she makes these works. She actually uses a mold of her vagina, right? And creates the mold and then makes works around that mold, right? First, she was making phone covers. She was making little landscapes. But she says, wait a second, you know what? If I'm making vagina art, she says, that's when I realized the power of cute is mighty. So she makes her vagina into a cute little character, right? Which is quite prevalent in Japan, where many cute characters are made, right? And she uses this Manko character as her spokesman, so to speak, or mascot. So why? Why is this censored? Why is this all declared obscene? I'm going to suggest that it's obscene because it's putting forward feminist ideas. Now, what is this definition of feminism? Again, this is a complicated term. I've got other videos about feminism and different kinds of feminism, but I think that one, no matter what kind of feminist is being exercised, one theme remains constant, and that is somehow empowering women and letting women express themselves to understand their place in society. She says that she looks up on Wikipedia this notion of feminism. She says, that's also where I first heard of a different way of thinking. That feminism is a different way of thinking. Brilliant. She goes on. It believed gender discrimination was wrong and that men and women and other gender minorities are all equal. That's right. Manko have rights too. I put all my hopes in that. So how is this empowering? In another part of her comic, she explains how this is empowering. She teaches other women to make Manko art. I was stoked there were so many women supporters. So many women come up to her and say, I love being able to say Manko out loud. I'm learning to honor my body. Another woman approaches her and says, your work is so positive. It's so fun and brings me so much happiness. That's in the manner of which I'm suggesting her work is empowering women in a feminist ideal. Yes? What other aspect of feminism is there? There is this other aspect of feminism of fighting back. And her work is fighting back. Fighting back against what? Well, for one thing, fighting back against being arrested and being censored for her works. She says, this was an unjust arrest. Why? My work represents my anger at a Japan that chooses to discriminate against female genitalia. She says it clear as day right there. She is angry with Japan. Why? Because of how it demeans her, how it tries to take power away from her. How? By not even being able to talk about her body. What I love about her work is she engages with this problem. Wait a second, why is it that my Manko is censored, but in so many other venues across Japan, the male genitalia is elevated and brought out for everybody to see? She asks, why is the Kanemaru festival okay and Manko isn't? Right? Where they are actually bringing out large penises on display. Furthermore, let's go even a bit further here. Why are super realistic portable pussies okay to sell, but not my Manko? She's calling out the patriarchal use of models of vaginas that are used for masturbation at pornography stores. Yeah, you can use and you can sell and you can make Manko if you use it for male happiness, mainly masturbation, right? But if she wants to make it and put it in an art gallery, put it in a comic, have women make art like cell phone covers, obscene, outlawed. Clearly, there's a double standard here where women and men are not equal, where women are subordinated. Men can do whatever they want with a woman's manko, including making it and modeling it and using it for masturbation purposes. But once a woman uses it and wants to say, look, let's empower each other with this, then it becomes obscene. Then it becomes censored. Then we have to throw you in jail and criminalize your behavior. Clearly, this is in need of fighting back. And now we understand a little bit more why she says she's so angry at Japan. How angry is she at Japan? She says, I'm the one they called crazy. But I realize it's Japan that has lost its mind. She says she is an artist with a mission. Another theme that she really explicates and explores in Japanese society is the Japanese legal system. She explains and illustrates so many ways in which the Japanese legal system is unjust and unfair to her. There's what in America we would call the violation of due process, where the cops admit, no, we forgot to read her right to remain silent. Another cop says, it's okay, let's just say you did hear your rights. And she says, this is not okay. That's a clear violation of due process. In Japan, she talks about the problem of coerced confessions, such that, wait, if I admit that I committed this crime of obscenity, then they'll let me out? Yeah, and then you'll just have to pay a small fine. That's an example of coerced confessions, such that just confess. We'll make it easier on you if you confess. Otherwise, we're going to make your life hell. And she talks about how her life was made hell in these harsh prison conditions. She says it's been 5 days since she's taken a bath. She talks about being in handcuffs where her hands feel like they're going to fall off and her fingers are numb. Of course, we've already discussed how she feels about the stupidity and ignorance of these prosecutors, of the legal system that is prosecuting crimes that they don't even understand, since they don't even know what crowdfunding is. If you don't know what crowdfunding is, how can you talk about how I'm distributing works, right? And she's got the prosecutor there saying, I don't know a lot about the internet. And she's crying, saying, how can you be prosecuting me for committing some crimes that you don't even know how the internet works? That means you don't understand how distribution works. I mean, that's just logic for you, right? Let's not even talk about the obscenity part. If you don't understand how the internet works, you don't understand how the crime was committed then. She also illustrates how patriarchal the legal system is. She says this is just a bunch of men deciding what to call obscene. All of the prosecutors, of course, being men. The text also relays in some prose a quote from The Economist, where in Japan, courts have a 99% conviction rate. What that means is, if you are prosecuted in Japan, you're pretty much guaranteed to be found guilty. Is that how the legal system should work? Now, I will wrap this discussion up with my own personal connections with this work and my own personal connections with censorship and obscenity and things like that. Well, first, before I get to my own personal experience, I want to express the love that I have for an interview that's at the end of this text. The interview is between Rokudenashiko and the famous Japanese filmmaker Sono Sion, of whom I've made a previous video covering and analyzing his movie called Land of Hope. The reason I expressed my love for Sono Sion in that video, and I get a chance here to express more love for Sono Sion again. right here. I love one quote that he makes in this text. He says, "Art isn't good unless you get arrested." Now, is that literally true? Maybe, maybe not. But what I love is the sentiment behind it. What do I mean by that? If you're not pushing boundaries, you're not making art. You're not making art if you're not pushing boundaries. If you're not scaring people. If you're not challenging the law, those in power, Sonosion suggests, then you're not making art. It's not expression if it doesn't brush up against the limits of law. I love that sentiment by Sonosion, of course. So how does that affect me? Well, I'm teaching this, and I love teaching works like this. And I've got colleagues at my school who will come up to me and say, "Wow, George, you like teaching that odd stuff." I'm like, yeah, that's right. I'm not going to teach all that fun Hello Kitty parts of Japan. If you want Hello Kitty, God bless you. Go study Hello Kitty. You won't get that from me. You want to study One Piece and other anime that are so popular, God bless you. Go read those somewhere else, but not with me. I want to dig a little bit deeper. And that's what I love about this work, is that when you dig deeper, you see that there are transgressive artists who are trying to push boundaries. And in doing so, I guess that means that I'm pushing boundaries. And in fact, I've been called out for pushing boundaries, for teaching this work. Let me give a little bit of why I'm teaching this work. One reason I'm teaching this work and making this video is because of a grant that I earned from the University of Washington. This University of Washington Asian and Global Studies grant was one that wanted people like me to promote and develop lessons that teach inclusive health and education, environmental justice and climate change, technology, democracy, security, migration, displacement, and refugees. Well, I focused on democracy. Democracy, liberal democracy, democracy and rights. And I feel like this work wrestles with all of that. How can you have a democracy without feminist equality? Without feminist concerns where women are empowered to express themselves? How can you have democracy where you're shutting down the voices of certain groups? You'll forgive me, but I like democracy. I like liberty, right? So, what happened when I tried to teach this? Well, the title of the work is, What is Obscenity? The Story of a Good-for-Nothing Artist and Her Pussy. It shocked me. While the University of Washington awarded me this grant and saw fit to teach this work at my own school, when I proposed to talk about this work, the word pussy was really pushed back against. Hey, George, you can't use that word in the title of your presentation. Right? Hey, George, so how about the word vagina? I had supervisors tell me, we don't like the word vagina in the title of this presentation. This is an institution of higher education in New York City. I was shocked. I was shocked that somebody would want to censor my use of the word vagina or pussy. Right? So, while Rokudenashiko asks, what is obscenity? Other people might ask, what is art? I'm asking, what is education? How can we have education if you're going to stop people from using certain words, the names of body parts? Let's recall Rokudenashiko's own words here, when she says, that's right, I'm part of your body, no different from your eyes, hands, or feet, or nose, or mouth. Yet, we can't utter the name of this body part, right? And she talks about how she can't utter this name in court, right? and that the judge is going to suppress her. And yet, supervisors of mine suggested that I should not use this word. And that blew my mind. And that made me very upset, actually. So the first time I gave this presentation, I was a little bit shaky. Why am I relaying that anecdote to you? Because it's clear to me that the struggles that Rokudenashiko is wrestling with in Japan are not just relevant in Japan, but they're relevant here in New York City, here in America. They're relevant everywhere around the world, where women are discouraged from expressing themselves, where people who want to talk about women expressing themselves are discouraged from saying the names of certain body parts. I don't know how anybody at my school would teach the work The Vagina Monologues, which is such a popular play, popular work of contemporary literature. I guess we can't teach that? I'm not sure. All I'm saying is that I love that I'm able to engage with Rokudenashiko. I love that I'm able to live in a world where Rokudenashiko and people like Sona Sion are fighting this good fight. Yes, for democracy, for equal rights, for liberty, just the right to express themselves and to empower themselves and take control of their own bodies, as opposed to letting other people use molds of their body parts for their own purposes. Rokudenashiko is trying to take back that control. That doesn't sound like a win to me. That does not sound like a win. That for 6 years of her life, she had to fight Japanese courts for the right to express her own body. I hope that she continues to fight. And I'm going to try to do what I can to fight alongside her. And I hope that people all over the world continue to fight this fight. See you next time. Bye-bye.